Is it possible that someone you entrust with your mental health could turn into a conduit for something dreadful? Dr. Ramirez, a psychiatrist with 20 years of experience treating mental illnesses, experienced this. When he met Sarah Mendoza, a young woman whose apparent schizophrenia had something considerably more dangerous in their initial sessions, his professional life took a terrifying turn. Dr. Ramirez was fascinated by Sarah's descriptions of the tormenting voices and shadows that Dan was surrounding her with. But the real horror started when he listened to the recordings of their sessions and heard a third voice, guttural and whispering in Latin, that blurred the boundaries between madness and the paranormal. Furthermore, a shadowy figure who he never saw at the time was caught on tape lurking behind her as she spoke by the clinic's surveillance cameras. The tension and oppression increased daily until Sarah abruptly disappeared without a trace. At that moment, Dr. Ramirez's world started to fall apart. Dr. Ramirez began to encounter a number of odd occurrences shortly after Sarah vanished. He initially believed them to be random occurrences or signs of the tension brought on by the circumstance. But soon the shadows in his office started to move erratically, as though they had come to life at night. The air was filled with twisted whispers. His blood was chilled by the echoes of a tongue he had forgotten. The sense of being watched grew stronger, as though invisible eyes were watching every inch of his office. His behavior started to shift during sessions with other patients. As though someone else were taking over his being, his voice became high-pitched and resonant, and he occasionally responded to inquiries that weren't his. During those times, his eyes would go entirely black, leaving behind a familiar depth that frightened everyone who happened to look at him. As the darkness engulfed him, Dr. Ramirez became obsessed with discovering the truth behind the voice that haunted Sarah. The recordings, which at first seemed to be just echoes of her madness, now turned into a map leading to a mystery that had been hidden for centuries. Each Latin word he was able to decipher brought him closer to a terrifying realization that he was dealing with more than just a case of mental illness. What had started as a simple consultation had transcended the bounds of reality and revealed a dark entity that had found a way to manifest in the physical world through his patients. He started looking into Sarah's past, probing into her life and the circumstances surrounding her treatment, as revelations created a maze of secrets that drew him further into the whirlpool of insanity, trapped between logic and the unfathomable. With each new discovery, he felt the shadows in his office grow denser, as if his quest for the truth was feeding the entity that haunted him. He came to discover an old journal one day that belonged to a psychiatrist who had spent decades working at the same clinic. Its pages contained testimonies of people who had encountered such occurrences, which spoke to the suffering he was currently going through. When revelation strikes a patient like a lightning strike, he becomes a gateway, one in crimson. Is it possible that Sarah was selected for something more than being a victim? Dr. Ramirez was desperate to break the cycle and escape the entity's influence. He looked for pacts, exorcism techniques, anything that might help him seal the gateway he had unintentionally let that voice appear. But every time he tried, it seemed to make the creature's hold on him stronger. Nights became a never-ending dance of terror. There was a strong, tangible atmosphere in the room as the Latin whispers grew louder. It became unbearable to feel as though unseen eyes were watching every inch of his office. He had an epiphany one evening while attempting to meditate. The thing thrived on his anxiety and distress. Every unpleasant feeling he experienced was a feast for it. Could it be that he might have an opportunity to break free by facing his own fear? He started to record his sessions, but in a new format. He gritted his teeth and faced the voice that haunted him. What started out as a desperate gesture swiftly turned into a conflict. In each session, the records revealed a far deeper psychological fight in addition to his outward struggle. His comments started to blend with the entities, forming a conversation that was tense but also contained tidbits of long-forgotten facts. In other recordings, the shadowy person behind Sarah eventually stopped being a dreaded mystery. Familiar figures emerged from the shadows, and Dr. Ramirez started to make out shapes in the little light. Maybe the thing wasn't as foreign to him as he had assumed, he thought. Through his recordings, he gained a greater understanding of his patients' thoughts and found tales of pain that paralleled his own experiences. It was as though the same anguish and despair had bound them all together, like unseen threads. Perhaps relating to the pain that had been held in limbo, was the key to comprehending this ominous voice. He was now battling not just for his own sanity, but also for the liberation of those who had become insane. He gathered his courage and made the decision to step up his investigation. He connected with paranormal experts who had devoted their lives to comprehending the inexplicable. Each encounter was like entering uncharted territory where legends and rituals blend with reality. Before long, Dr. Ramirez was enmeshed in a world where the lines between science and the supernatural blurred, a world that contradicted everything he had learned and thought the struggle grew more intense as the days went by. Every night became a conflict between Dr. Ramirez's reasoning and the darkness that surrounded him during his most vulnerable moments. And he realized he wasn't fighting this battle alone. The echoes of the patients he had treated reverberated in his mind, reminding him that his purpose had always been to help those who suffered. But now the help he offered was twofold. He wanted to free himself as well as all those who had been led to madness. With renewed resolve, he started to plan group sessions with his former patients, sharing experiences and creating a united front. He would draw the entity out, forcing it to confront its true self. The plan was risky, but the only way to break the cycle of despair that accompanied his patients was to face the horror head-on. During those sessions, the Latin murmurs became more intense, and the shadows seemed to come to life, creating an atmosphere filled with tension and terror. However, one night as he was getting ready for his most daring session, Dr. Ramirez heard a whisper that made his blood freeze. Sarah's voice was quite clear when she told him to stop since he didn't understand what he was doing. At the end of the night, as Heap was getting ready to face the horror that had plagued his life, he felt that the time had come to untie the knot that bound him to evil. But what he found in the shadows was something he could never have imagined, an echo of what once was his life. The voice said that even though he realized that the path he had chosen could have unimaginable consequences, his desire to help and save himself outweighed his fear. After that night, Dr. Ramirez was never the same, and if he was able to break the connection between him and the evil force, the wounds from the encounter will always be with him. In addition to documenting his personal struggle, the recordings he left behind became a reminder that the paranormal is constantly present in the shadows. He reminds us via his own and his patients' stories that genuine fear frequently lurks in the deepest recesses of our thoughts, and that sometimes facing it head-on is the only path to serenity. The next story: imagine being able to see more than your reflection in a mirror. At night, when shadows come to life and old secrets try to surface, would you dare to gaze at it? The tale of the day leads us to an object that appears innocuous, but conceals a sinister and unsettling secret. My grandmother's antique Victorian mirror had been hidden in a corner of her home for as long as I can remember. She was often telling us about the unique power of that mirror and how it should not be taken lightly. These stories used to make me feel a weird kind of anxiety as a kid, as though there was something out there that only the mirror could see. My grandmother always insisted that no one should remove the cloth that covered it, but she never explained why in detail. She only said that the mirror was a portal, a window to a world that did not belong to ours. After my grandmother passed away, my mother decided to ignore her warnings and uncover the mirror. That act would mark the beginning of a series of events that would change our lives forever. That first night, I clearly remember the atmosphere at home. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense of expectation mixed with fear. My mother was in the living room looking at the mirror with a mixture of curiosity and defiance. When she finally removed the cloth, we all fell silent, as if we were waiting for something to happen, and it did. That same night, as we were getting ready for bed, a strange noise from the living room alerted us. When we arrived, we saw something. I will never forget my grandmother's reflection in the mirror, but it was not a comforting image. Her smile was a disconcerting grimace rather than the kind one we recalled. After that night, things started to change. The mirror seemed to have a life of its own, and occasionally when I passed by it, I had the impression that someone was watching me from the other side. Her eyes were two dark, empty pits filled with an unfathomable evil, and her teeth were sharp, almost animal-like. I could see shadows that had no light source in our realm were moving across its surface. The mirror became the main character in my nightmare-filled, gloomy dreams. In those nightmares, I saw my grandmother, but she was different. She seemed to want to tell me something, but her words were jumbled. laced with cries of fear and maudlin laughter. I had the impression that something wasn't right when I woke up one night. I was horrified to see my mother standing in front of the mirror, seemingly hypnotized, when I descended into the living room. Like my grandmother's eyes in the mirror, hers were vacant. I shook her and attempted to wake her, but it seemed like she wasn't there. I saw then that my mother's image was not the only reflection in the mirror. Behind her was a shadow that shifted and shifted. A figure. I knew we were in trouble when that figure gave me a direct look. In a desperate attempt to find out where the mirror came from, I turned. It had belonged to a family that had been devastated by unfathomable events, I found out. All the members who had possessed the mirror had died violently and too soon. Although the stories were all horrifying, they were all similar in that the mirror appeared to be there throughout the most difficult times in those people's life. I started to realize that the mirror was an entrance to something far more than just an object, dark and menacing. One night while my mother was sleeping, I wrapped the mirror in cloth and carried it to the basement in the hopes that its influence would be lessened. However, the mirror's evil presence persisted despite my attempts to persuade her to get rid of it because she was too swayed by its power. After a string of upsetting incidents, my mother decided it was time to act together. We took the mirror to an antique store in the hopes of getting rid of it permanently, but the store owner, an elderly man with a worried expression, warned us that the mirror had a dark energy that could not be ignored. He told us about other similar objects he had seen over the years, and how all of them had a malevolent power that attracted lost souls. The shadows in the house grew denser, and the strange noises became more frequent, and I felt like we were being watched, as if something was waiting for us in the dark. The man's warning only increased our fear. We decided to take the mirror to a desolate place where no one could find it. That night we drove to a remote forest and buried the mirror, hoping its influence would dissipate in the ground. But even as we buried it, we felt something watching us from the shadows. We knew the mirror would not leave so easily. After getting rid of the mirror, things improved a bit. The noises and shadows in the house decreased, and we began to regain a sense of normalcy. However, we never forgot the nights of terror we had lived, and we always feared the mirror could somehow return. Every time I passed by a mirror, I couldn't help but look at it with distrust, hoping not to see my grandmother's sinister smile with time. My mother and I tried to return to our normal routines, although fear always throbbed in the back of our minds. Every creak of the house, every shadow at the corner of our eyes reminded us that the mirror had once been in our lives. One night, while reviewing old family photographs, I found an image of my grandmother when she was young, standing in front of the same mirror. Her smile was calm, but there was something unsettling in her gaze, as if she knew something we did not. I decided to investigate more about my grandmother's life and discovered that she had inherited the mirror from her own mother, who had also told similar stories about its power. Our family appears to have been impacted by this cycle of terror for generations. As I learned more about the mirror's past, I realized that its impact was more profound and ancient than we had initially thought. During my research, I discovered an old journal kept by an ancestor who had attempted to destroy the mirror. The journal warned of the dangers, but also described procedures and strategies to cut the mirror's ties to the dark world to which it belonged. I decided that I had to try it. Despite the danger, I convinced my mother that this was our only chance to free ourselves from the evil that haunted us. That same night, we went to the forest where we had buried the mirror. The atmosphere was heavy, and the air seemed to vibrate with dark energy. We unearthed the mirror and began the ritual according to the diary's instructions. As we recited the ancient words, we felt a growing presence around us. Suddenly, the mirror began to tremble, and a dark figure appeared on its surface with the same black eyes and sharp teeth we had seen before. With determination, we continued the ritual, and the figure in the mirror began to fade, letting out a scream that echoed in the forest. Finally, the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, and a sense of relief enveloped us. We felt that the connection to the dark world had been cut, and the evil that had haunted us for generations had finally been defeated. We returned home with lighter hearts. For the first time in a long time, we slept without fear of shadows and strange noises. Grandma's mirror is a story of how a simple object can harbor indescribable evil, and how courage and determination can overcome even the darkest horrors. The house returned to its peace, and our lives resumed their normal routine. but we will never forget the terrifying nights we spent in the fight we had with the cursed mirror friends. Please remember to follow our channel, like, and comment on the article if you enjoyed it. We're always here to share more terrifying tales with you. See you in the following story.